Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. This time we're diving headfirst into the economic landscape of Trump's second term.
Yeah, so we've got this Spanish language financial article from January 2025, right as Trump started his second term. And I know what you might be thinking. Haven't we seen this all before?
Well, there are definitely some parallels to that 2017 Trump trade, but this time around there are some twists. This article highlights that banks and oil companies are surging right at the start of his second term, just like they did back in 17. But with the Fed doing things differently this time and all these Silicon Valley technoligarchs, supposedly advising Trump, could this be more than just a simple repeat?
It's a good question a lot of people are asking. Back in 2017, Trump's policies, those like reflationist policies,
Hmm.
tax cuts and deregulation, all designed to really jumpstart the economy. Well, they were a hit with investors. I mean, the S&P 500 jumped over 60% during those 4 years.
60%. Wow. That's massive. And this article says US markets were already doing incredibly well in 2024. Both the S&P and Nasdaq were up over 20% for the second year in a row. And it even mentions that the markets rallied right after Trump's election victory in November 2024. So are we just seeing history repeat itself?
Well, not exactly. The Fed isn't playing the same game this time. You see, back in 2017, the Fed was all about quantitative easing, pumping money into the economy, to encourage lending and growth. They doubled down on that during the pandemic, but now they're being much more cautious, worried about inflation.
So less easy money flowing around. Okay, that's a big difference. And where do these so-called technoligarchs fit into all of this? The article mentions some of these tech figures, and even Trump himself are really into Bitcoin. Doesn't that kind of align with the Fed wanting a more controlled approach?
Well, on the surface, yeah, there's a potential alignment there on monetary policy. But you have to remember that Silicon Valley thrives on disruption. They're likely to push for policies that favor tech innovation. And that could create some real tension with the Fed's cautious approach.
Hold on a second, though. This article also points out that even during Biden's presidency, the S&P still went up like 50%. So was this whole Trump trade really all about Trump, or was there just this bigger economic way of lifting everybody up?
Right. It's a good question. It suggests that maybe Trump's policies just sped things up a bit. But the groundwork for a market upswing was already there. But this time the playing field is different.
Okay, so let's get into the specifics of this Trump trade 2.0. What's actually happening right now in the market?
Well, in the first few weeks of 2025, the Dow Jones surged 3.7% and the S&P 500 rose 2.9%. Those were their biggest weekly jumps since that November election.
So a strong start, it's giving me deja vu. But the article makes a point of saying that banks and oil companies were the real winners in this initial rally, almost like we're rewinding back to 2017.
It's exactly. Citigroup, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, they all saw increases of over 10%. And the oil giants like Exxon and Marathon Petroleum weren't too far behind.
So strong corporate earnings, particularly in banking, and then oil prices are on the rise. It all seems to point to the Trump trade making a comeback. But is it really that simple?
So that's what we need to figure out. The article warns us that while those similarities to 2017 are tempting, the world has changed.
Okay, so what are we missing here? What's lurking beneath the surface of this boom?
Well, let's start with those technoligarchs. They're a new variable in this equation, and their influence could be pretty significant.
Okay, let's dive into that then. What are these technoligarchs advocating for? And how might their vision clash with the more traditional players?
It's hard to say exactly what their policy agenda is, but it's a safe bet they're pushing for, a tech-centric future. Think deregulation in areas like AI development, data privacy, maybe even cryptocurrency.
So while all these banks and oil companies are, celebrating this kind of familiar boom, Silicon Valley's maybe quietly setting the stage for something completely different.
Right, and that could lead to some serious tension. Imagine the Fed trying to control inflation by raising interest rates. That could really put a damper on the easy money that tech companies rely on for rapid growth and innovation.
It's an interesting dynamic, this clash between the old guard, like the Fed and the banks and these Silicon Valley disruptors. And where does Trump fit into all of this?
That's the wild card. Will he side with those traditional financial institutions that have always, supported him? Or will he embrace this more radical, tech-driven vision of these technoligarchs?
It feels like we're watching this high-stakes poker game unfold, and we haven't even talked about the global implications of all this. The article mentions that the global landscape has shifted since Trump's first term.
Oh, absolutely. The U.S. isn't operating in a vacuum. What happens here has ripple effects all over the world.
All right, the article brought up rising oil prices as a reason for the energy sector's gains. But what if there's like instability in the Middle East, or if demand for oil suddenly drops?
Those are great points. This whole Trump trade, both now and in 2017, depends on this delicate balance of factors. Disrupt that balance, and the whole thing could come crashing down.
Okay, so we've got this potential clash between the Fed and Silicon Valley. We've got a president stuck in the middle, and a global landscape that's way more interconnected and unpredictable than ever. What should we be watching for as this all plays out?
I'd say keep a close eye on the Fed.
Yeah.
Their decisions on interest rates are going to be crucial. If they tighten things up too much, they could stifle growth and maybe even trigger a recession.
And how about the technoligarchs? How can we tell how much influence they actually have?
Look for changes in policy, particularly in areas like tech regulation and cryptocurrency. See where Trump's administration is putting its resources. Those are the real signs of, who's winning the tug of war for his attention.
It's like we're witnessing this battle for the future of the American economy. The old versus the new, the established players versus the disruptors.
And remember, we're only looking at a tiny snapshot of this whole story. It's just the very beginning of Trump's second term. This article captures that initial excitement of Trump trade 2.0. But the long-term picture, well, it's anything but clear.
The article also mentioned that European markets have been doing pretty well, especially luxury brands and automakers. Is that a sign that the Trump trade is having a global impact?
It's possible. Remember, economies are all interconnected. A strong U.S. market can boost confidence around the world.
True, but the article also said that the Japanese market actually went down, maybe because of worries about those rising interest rates we were just talking about. So it doesn't seem to be affecting every country the same way.
Right, and that just goes to show how complex this situation is. There are so many factors at play, both here in the U.S. and internationally. It's like trying to predict the weather weeks in advance. You can see some patterns, but there's always that chance of a sudden storm.
Speaking of storms, we can't forget about the political climate. Trump is, well, he's a polarizing figure, to say the least.
Absolutely. And that kind of polarization can create a lot of uncertainty in the markets. Investors don't like uncertainty. It makes them nervous.
So how could political turmoil derail this whole Trump trade?
Well, imagine there's a major political scandal or a sudden policy change.
Hmm.
That could easily scare off investors and lead to a sell-off.
And then there's the impact on consumer confidence. If people are worried about what's happening politically, they're less likely to spend money. And that could slow down the whole economy.
Exactly. It all goes back to that delicate balance we talked about. Political instability could be the thing that tips the scales and sends everything into a tailspin.
It's interesting, though, the article pointed out that even under Biden, the S&P 500 still rose by 50%. Does that mean the Trump trade is more about these larger economic trends than it is about Trump himself?
It's definitely a possibility. Maybe Trump's policies just amplified trends that were already happening. But the article also argues that his specific policies, like those tax cuts and deregulation, played a big role in speeding up that growth.
It's like trying to untangle a knot. You pull on one thread and the whole thing shifts.
And that's what makes this so fascinating. It's not a simple cause and effect situation.
Mhm.
We're talking about a system where everything's interconnected.
We've talked about the Fed, the technoligarchs, the global picture, even the political climate. Is there anything else we need to consider to really understand this Trump trade 2.0?
Well, there's one more crucial piece of the puzzle: technology.
Oh, of course. The article talks about how technological innovation is transforming the economy.
Exactly, and it's happening on a scale we haven't seen before.
Hmm.
We think about artificial intelligence automation, even things like blockchain technology. They're reshaping entire industries and creating all these new opportunities.
But technology can also be disruptive. I mean, we're already seeing concerns about jobs being replaced and the gap between the rich and the poor getting wider.
Right, that's the double-edged sword of technological progress. It creates incredible potential, but it also comes with risks.
So how does this all tie back into the Trump trade?
Well, let's say AI-driven automation starts replacing jobs even faster than it is now. That could lead to social unrest, political instability, even a declining consumer spending.
It's like we're trying to predict the future of the economy while standing on quicksand.
And that's what makes this whole deep dive so interesting. We're not just analyzing a static situation. We're trying to make sense of a system that's constantly in motion, a system where the rules are always changing.
And in that kind of environment, being able to adapt and learn is essential.
Absolutely. The winners in this new economy won't be the ones who cling to the old ways. It'll be the ones who can embrace change and harness the power of innovation.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've looked at the potential for both booms and busts, for a return to what we've seen before, and a jump into the unknown.
And while we can't predict the future for sure, This discussion has given you the tools and the information you need to make smart decisions and handle whatever comes next.
This deep dive has really been eye-opening. We've explored the potential for both success and failure, for familiarity and for completely new territory.
And even though we can't say for sure what will happen, we've given you the knowledge to make informed choices and navigate whatever lies ahead.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
So it feels like we're at this crossroads with this whole Trump trade 2.0 thing. Like on one hand, we have this surge in, banks and oil. It's like a flashback to 2017. But then we also have these technoligarchs and the Fed being all cautious and the global landscape being, well, totally unpredictable. So what are the possible scenarios here? Like what could actually happen? Well, one possibility is that, all this early excitement kind of fizzles out as the reality of how much the world has changed sets in. I mean, the Fed's trying to control inflation, right? So that could cool things down, especially if those technoligarchs can't get Trump on board with their whole vision. We could see a correction or slower growth, even a recession.
So basically, the Trump trade 2.0 could just disappear and everyone's left wondering what happened.
It's definitely possible.
Yeah.
But there's another scenario where this whole thing is just the beginning, like the first act of something much bigger.
Okay, now you've got me curious. What's this other path look like?
Imagine if Trump does decide to side with those technoligarchs. We could see a wave of deregulation in the tech sector, which would lead to super fast innovation and growth in things like AI and cryptocurrency. And that could create whole new industries, new jobs. It would totally reshape the American economy.
So instead of just going back to 2017, we're talking about something totally new, like a tech-driven boom that changes the definition of what a Trump trade even is.
Exactly. But there are risks with this path too, of course. What about jobs being replaced? The gap between the rich and poor getting even bigger. All the ethical questions around AI, those are all serious challenges.
So it's like we're choosing between two different futures, each with its own good and bad things.
And it's not just up to Trump to decide. It's up to policymakers, business leaders, and regular people like us.
So what can we do, like as individuals trying to navigate all this economic uncertainty?
Pay attention. Stay informed about policy changes, new technologies, what's happening around the world. Don't just read the headlines, dig a little deeper, question things, form your own opinions.
That's really good advice. It's easy to get caught up in the excitement or the fear. But what we've learned from this deep dive is that we have to look beyond the surface. We have to understand just how complicated all this is.
Exactly. And in a world that's changing so fast, the most important skill is being able to adapt and learn new things.
This deep dive has really been fascinating. We've talked about the possibility of both booms and busts, of going back to what we know and jumping into the unknown.
And while we can't predict the future for sure, this discussion has given you the tools and information to make smart decisions and be ready for whatever happens next.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. We'll see you on the next one.